Why do people resort to terrorism in the Middle East? And is that method of combat ever justified at all, or at the very least understandable? Well, stay tuned as we explore that, and more generally the Algerian conflict for independence from France from 1954 to 1962. In the last few videos, we have been exploring the decolonization movement of the 1940s and 50s, which was kind of an outgrowth of World War II. The first case study we did was the case of India in 1947, and that was a good example of a British colony that obtained independence in Asia, and in a way that was largely non-violent. Well, today we're going to move to the second wave of decolonization that happened a bit later on the African continent, and it will be a French colony and will be a much more violent process. So let's start with the question of why would the Algerians independence in the first place? Why do you not like the French people? Why would anybody not like French people? Well, they had their reasons. The French had done some good in Algeria, such as ending piracy along the Barbary coast, developing the agricultural system, setting up a wine industry, building some modern quarters in Algiers, the capital. But the majority of the Algerian population had a very different view of the pattern. For the first thing, they thought of the French colonization as a violent process, that they had been conquered by the French in 1827, 1830, much against their will. And then in the 1830s and 40s, they had a long war against the French rule, a guerrilla war, led by their leader Abdelkader, which had been unsuccessful, and that's why the French had stuck around for another 100 years. So that's not something they had wanted in the first place. Beyond that, there was a sense of dichotomy in Algerian society. Some of the Algerians would be pieds noirs, as the French people call them. It translates as black feet, but it has nothing to do with the color of their feet. They would be French settlers going to Algeria, and there were quite a few of them. The French sent few settlers to their colonies, but Algeria was the one exception. The climate is rather pleasant. It's just across the Mediterranean Sea from France. So it's an area where about 1 million French settlers, the pieds noirs, lived by the 1950s. Beyond that, there would be a local population that was mostly Muslim, and some of them would be of Arab descent or maybe Kabyle descent. They were the majority, about, say, 9 million people by the 1950s. But their status, both economic and political, was not quite as good as that of the French. Economically, the French might be bureaucrats or teachers, and the Algerians oftentimes might be field laborers, day laborers on the farms of the French people, or in the case of women, maybe a maid in a French household. So you had a big economic gap. Ben Bella, for example, that became the leader of the independence movement, came from a poor family of Moroccan immigrants to Algeria. Politically, there was also a sense of a two-tiered society. The French eventually obtained the status of citizens of France, and the fact that Algeria would be not a colony of France, but a département of France. As a département, which is a basic administrative unit in France, Algeria would be like any other part of France, whether you're in Paris or Brittany or Aquitaine. And so they could vote in French election and so forth, and Algeria was really a territorial extension of the French nation, in the same way that Hawaii would have the same status as any other US state, from Ohio to California. So that gave a lot of rights to people in Algeria, but the citizenship was not extended equally to all the people. Typically, the pieds noirs would be French citizens, but a lot of the Muslim population would be considered to be indigènes or sujets, the indigenous people, the natives, the subjects, and they would not have full citizenship rights. Even though they were adults, they were kind of like minors from a legal perspective. So that made for a situation that was quite unfair to them, politically speaking. And if you complain, as Ben Bella did, then you might be sent to prison, and he spent quite a bit of his life in prison. That became especially galling in World War I and World War II, where France fought two very bitter conflicts against Germany, lost a lot of men in the process, and had to tap the human reservoir of its colonies. So quite a few people from Algeria were drafted in World War I and World War II and fought rather violently for France. But when the war was over and they asked for equal rights because they had shed their blood from France, the response was generally, well, thank you for dying for us. You get that part of the citizenship bargain. As far as voting or equal rights, maybe not. So the whole concept of self-determination, which Woodrow Wilson had put forward in World War I, and that Franklin D. Roosevelt had recycled in his Atlantic Charter in World War II, really had a lot of resonance in Algeria to the Algerians. There's also the example of Indochina, where in Southeast Asia in the 40s and 50s, Ho Chi Minh, the communist leader, waged a successful war of independence against the French using guerrilla methods and proving that can be done. We can defeat the French militarily. The war in Indochina with Ho Chi Minh ended with a Vietnamese victory in 1954. In May is when you have the Geneva Accords. The beginning of the War of Independence in Algeria began in November of that year, so there's a clear continuation there. When I speak of the movement for independence in Algeria, I'm speaking of the Front de Libération Nationale, which you could translate in English by just flipping the letters around and becomes the National Liberation Front. And the leader would be the man you see on the photo right now. His name was Ahmed Ben Bella. So if you are Ben Bella, how do you get the French out of Algeria? That will be a difficult mission because Algeria is the one colony that the French really wanted to hang on to. Places like the French Congo or Gabon or the Ivory Coast, the French population there was rather limited, so it's easier to let go around 1960 when most of these places get their independence. Algeria, however, had been French for a much longer time. It had a much larger French population of Pieds Noirs, and it was technically a part of the French nation as a département. So that's one place that France would not let go. So to get the French out, Ben Bella drew largely from the examples of Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, meaning the use of guerrilla warfare. So you would have hit-and-run tactics against isolated French outposts in the mountains of northern Algeria, trying to eventually drag them into a long conflict, and then they would be tired and leave before the war was over. That's a technique that we've talked in the context of Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam. We'll also have a later video about Castro and Che Guevara and how they took over in Cuba in 1959. All of these are the same techniques of guerrilla warfare. But what's more unique about the conflict in Algeria was the use of terrorism as well. Specifically in 1957, you have a series of attacks in Algiers known collectively as the Battle of Algiers. It's not a battle in the traditional sense of having tanks lined up and aircraft. The Algerians in the FLN had none of that. Instead, it would be more a series of terrorist attacks in French cafes, dancing halls, Air France ticket counters targeted civilians. I highly recommend that you watch the movie also called The Battle of Algiers, which is by director Gillo Pontecorvo. It's a movie from the 60s, which attempts to recreate the events of the Algerian War of Independence by using a lot of non-professional actors. And it's done in a way that was generally positive towards the Algerians because it was shot in Algeria after independence, but it's surprisingly balanced and unflinching in showing all aspects of the war, including the reality of the use of terrorism and how it impacts the French civilians. How is terrorism supposed to work? Why do you employ terrorism? Because it is based on targeting civilians, which is the big no-no in regular warfare. The whole notion of trying to make warfare civilized through the Geneva Conventions of the late 19th, early 20th century was all about making sure that civilians get spared, that you wear uniform to clearly identify who the enemy is, and you do your utmost to not kill civilians, to not have collateral damage. Well, terrorism flips that around where the entire goal is to target civilians in the first place. So that makes it rather immoral as a form of war. Why would you target civilians? Well, the way Ben Bella would defend it, and he granted a number of interviews like in life to try to justify what he had been doing. For once, it's a much easier target. It's a soft target. It's much easier to kill a little boy licking his ice cream in a cafe in Algiers than it is to attack an actual French army post. It's a soft target. It's also cheap, so available to what was a fairly small organization at first, like the FLN. And if you compare it to, say, the 9/11 attacks in 2001, well, all you need is 19 people that are radicalized enough with box cutters, and you can inflict tremendous damage, in that case, the destruction of the Twin Towers. So it's a cheap method, and a method of the weak. It's often employed by people that don't have a traditional army. People like the Palestinians of Israel, who have lost every single regular war against the Israeli, who don't have any hope of overwhelming the modern Israeli army, and so they rely on terrorism as a weapon of the weak. And that's another defense that Ben Bella would offer. And if we had tanks, we'd be happy to fight in a more natural way, more traditional way. But since we don't, we have to fight differently. Still, how do you expect to win by just killing civilians? I mean, that's not going to weaken France. Well, part of it is psychological warfare, and that's where you get the term terrorism. It's to inflict terror in the mind of the enemy. Specifically, that you might terrorize enough the Pieds Noirs that they'll pack up and leave and go back to France. And if you don't have any French people in Algeria, no reason for France to be there. So flipping now to the French side in the Algerian War of Independence. Imagine yourself as a French general who arrives in Algiers in 1957 after that wave of terrorist attacks. How do you fight back? It's not easy because you were trained to fight against the most likely war in the 50s is the communists from Russia attacking across Germany. So you were trained in conventional combat, and there's none of that in Algeria in the 50s. So it's more of a police operation than a traditional army battle. Knowing who your enemy is, that's the issue. After that, you have all the firepower in the world to defeat it. Support the civilian population is essential because they could hide your enemy, or they could rat them out and then tell you, well, this person is a member of the FLN. Remember, they don't wear uniforms. So one technique that can be used in counterinsurgency operations would be the technique of winning over the hearts and minds, which is an expression that was used a lot by the US Army in Vietnam in the 60s when faced with a similar situation. Winning over the hearts and minds. So maybe extending greater political rights to Algerians, trying to do development projects, raising salaries, all that the French army tried in the 50s. And won the support of some Algerians. In particular, there were some people called the Harki, H-A-R-K-I, which would be the pro-French Algerians of Muslim descent that were in favor of France during that period. But they still remain a minority. Beyond that, what could you do if that fails? Well, you need to know where your enemy is, and you don't. So you do checkpoints or denunciations or just mass arrest of people, and you start interrogating them, are you a member of the FLN? Which obviously they'll say, well, no, I'm not, whether it's true or not. So you end up with a situation very similar to when we talked about the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, where the dominant power, not knowing who the enemy is, just casts a wide net, arrests every suspicious young male in the country, and starts questioning them, meaning torturing them. And most countries are unwilling, especially in the West, to use the word torture because that's a violation of human rights. So they use a variety of euphemisms, or just don't admit to it in public. It took a very long time for the French government to admit that they had used torture in Algeria. Or you have a similar scandal in 2003 when the US invaded Iraq. The Iraqis also employed terrorist methods against the US occupation. And then you have all the horrors happening in Guantanamo or the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, and the use of methods known as enhanced interrogation, I think in army parlance, because people are tiptoeing around the issue and not wanting to call it what it is, torture. So ultimately, by using torture, you can figure out a bit more about who the enemy is and arrest more people and torture them and get more names. But in doing so, you lose kind of the heart and soul of your democracy. And also, you have cast such a wide net that you torture a lot of innocent people and then you release them. Well, these will become recruits for the FLN after that. And what initially was a fairly small group, the FLN, grew and grew and grew because the French army was provoked into doing exactions in Algeria, which is the whole point of what the FLN was trying to do through using terrorism in the first place. Force the other side down to your level. You're using dirty techniques, terrorism, they were forced to use a dirty technique, torture. And Algeria became known as la sale guerre, the dirty war. So ultimately, you can't really win that conflict, or at least not in a way that is acceptable to the French public. And the French public paid attention because the army dragged a lot of French conscripts into Algeria. You still had draft back then in the French army, and a lot of people were sent to Algeria and eventually died there. I think France lost about 100,000 men in Algeria. If you're interested in that episode, I would highly recommend that you watch Les Parapluies de Cherbourg, The Umbrellas of Cherbourg, featuring a young Catherine Deneuve. And it's more of a sappy, romantic story. There's a lot of singing going on. It's a musical. But the crux of the movie is that the person that she loved, he is drafted to go to Algeria. And then she has to decide, does she wait for his return, though she's pregnant by then, or does she marry somebody with money so that she has a more respectable lifestyle? You have to watch the movie to know the answer. A little side note, that was the inspiration for the movie La La Land by Damien Chazelle. Getting back away from Catherine Deneuve and sappy French musicals to the war in Algeria, the impact was tremendous to the point where France was just torn over the matter as to whether to stay in Algeria or not. And torn to the point where the government fell, and not just government, but the whole regime. France was governed by the Constitution of the Fourth Republic. That came to an end in 1958. And you had the creation of a whole new constitution, a whole new regime, the Fifth Republic, which is still the one in effect in France. And to solve the matter, a new president was called upon, and that would be Charles de Gaulle. We met Charles de Gaulle before. He was a veteran from World War II, where he had been one of the few heroic figures to come out of the French army in World War II, had fought the Germans bravely in 1940, then had refused to accept defeat, moved to England, tried to rally a whole army in exile called the Free French, and had been part of the liberation of France in 1944. After retirement, because he was the one French person that everybody in France could rally upon, he was called upon as a savior to recreate French institutions, become president of France, and then solve that Algerian mess. So what did de Gaulle do when he became president of France in 1958? He had kind of hinted that he would preserve Algeria as a French colony, but by the time he got to Algeria on kind of a tour to assess the situation, he very quickly concluded that this was not a war that he could win, or at least not in the way that he would have been comfortable with. So de Gaulle, in 1962, decided to withdraw from Algeria, and you have a signature of a treaty known as the Evian Accords, accord as in like an agreement, treaty, and Evian as in, well, the mineral water you might drink, that's the same place where the water comes from. That Evian Accord is the one that ended the war in Algeria, where France withdrew and Algeria became independent. One question was, what happens to the Pieds-Noirs, or that 1 million French settlers that live in Algeria, have been there for generations, and as far as they're concerned, it's their country too. Technically, they were supposed to be allowed to remain after independence in Algeria, but once Ben Bella and the FNN took over, typically they told the Pieds-Noirs, you have the choice between la valise et le cercueil, either the suitcase or the coffin. Many of them settled in kind of the southern part of France, in the French Riviera, which is a fairly similar climate to North Africa, and there's still a very distinct community. In their politics, they tend to be fairly far-right allies of the National Front. That is kind of the anti-Muslim party in France, due to personal reasons that they emerged from that dirty war in Algeria. You're dealing with events that are in 1962, so it's fairly recent, about 50 years from now. And many of them are still very much alive and have continued to permeate the history of French-Algerian relations. And by permeate, I mean to poison. So how did events unfold after 1962? Did France and Algeria manage to mend fences and establish a more normal set of relations? Or are we still living with kind of the bitter aftermath of that very bitter conflict? Well, we'll learn about that in the second part of that video as we bring the story all the way to the present. Warning, there might be some soccer involved.